Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to a webinar on intellectual humility in theory and practice. My name is Dean Moyer. I'm professor of philosophy at Johns Hopkins, work on political philosophy, German idealism, among other things, and I'm the moderator for this panel. I'm joined today by philosopher Paul Franks, Baltimore NAACP President Reverend Kobi Little, political theorist Sarah Rushing, and sociologist Andrew Perrin. And I want to just get started by thanking Agora, SNF Agora Institute, and Hari Han, the director, and also thanking them for the faculty grant program, which has made this event possible. I want to thank our panelists for being here, and thank all of you who are tuning in. You'll see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A function where you can sort of submit questions that we will get to later in the event. So I'm very excited for our discussion today of intellectual humility, what it is, what roles it can play in our educational, spiritual, and political practices. Here's the plan for the event. I'm going to introduce each speaker separately, and I've asked them each to give a 5 to 10 minute presentation about intellectual humility, drawing on their own research and experience. And after those, I'll lead a discussion among the panelists for 20 minutes or so before turning to audience questions. So yeah, feel free to raise questions, put them in the Q&A while our presenters are speaking. Okay, well, let's get right to our first panelist, Paul Franks. Paul Franks is the Robert F. and Patricia Weis Professor of Philosophy and Judaic Studies and a Professor of Religious Studies at Yale University. He specializes in Jewish philosophy, German idealism, the work of Immanuel Kant, metaphysics and epistemology, and the philosophy of the human sciences. He's also the author of the 2005 book, All or Nothing, which has been really influential in the field and was really influential for my own work. So I'll turn it over to you, Paul.
Good morning. Well, first of all, thanks to the Agora Institute and to Dean Moyer for making this conversation possible. I'm going to raise 3 questions about intellectual humility. First of all, I'll come back to all of these, but just to say what they are in the first place. First of all, how do we distinguish humility from a kind of self-abnegation that undermines agency? Second question, how do we distinguish humility from submission to something that is not a rational factor in decision-making and belief formation? And thirdly, is there a way that we can humbly learn from one another without installing some sort of human representative of God as authoritative? Those are the questions that I'd like to raise. I'm going to do that by saying a little bit about the history of philosophy, but I think that the questions are relevant to civic life as well, far beyond the history of philosophy itself. So let's start with the first question then. How to distinguish humility from self-abnegation? I think it's generally well accepted that for the ancient Greeks, in their discussions of ethics and of virtue, humility is not one of the virtues. Rather, they tend to talk about greatness of the soul in a way that seems to exclude humility or make it even out to be a sort of a vice. Not so for philosophers coming from the Abrahamic traditions. They focus very heavily on humility. And when they're adapting Aristotelian virtue ethics, as a range of philosophers do in the 12th to 13th century, Al-Ghazali, Maimonides, and Aquinas come to mind, they focus on humility as really very central to their idea of ethical behavior, and one that doesn't fit the Aristotelian model. So on the Aristotelian account, virtue involves a golden mean between 2 extremes, but humility is not that way as the Abrahamic philosophers see it. It's something where a certain kind of excess seems built in. Now, for me, Maimonides is the most important for my own work, coming from the Jewish tradition. So there, the thought starts with Moses, right? Moses, according to the biblical book of Numbers in the Pentateuch, was very humble, more so than any other human being on earth. That's quite a remarkable statement. And in the Talmud, we're told that conversely, arrogance would be a sort of idolatry. Arrogance would be putting yourself in the place of God. So the thought that Maimonides draws from this is that humility is if you like, the cardinal virtue, because it signifies that one is the servant of a larger cause. One is a servant of God. And there, as I said, he emphasizes that this is not a question of the golden mean. Humility is something that doesn't have degrees of that kind. Incidentally, although he doesn't discuss it, in the Talmudic discussion he draws upon much earlier, there is some thought that maybe humility could be taken to an excess. So there is a dispute among the rabbis in the 3rd century about whether humility should be completely all-encompassing and arrogance should therefore be completely eliminated, or whether one needs a little bit of arrogance. So Rabbi Chia Bar Abba, for example, from 3rd century, says that one needs an eighth of arrogance. Just a tiny amount, just enough to be noticeable. And I think that probably what generates that thought is the question that I'm trying to raise here, namely that if you are too humble, that could be a negation of oneself that would make it impossible to be an agent in one's own right. And in fact, if you go back to that original passage from the book of Numbers, the context in which we are told that Moses was very humble, more than any other person, is the one where his brother and sister, Aaron and Miriam, are bad-mouthing him. And he doesn't stand up for himself. And instead, God intervenes and there's a punishment and so on. So the way the rabbis read that, which is what Maimonides is drawing upon, God has to intervene because Moses is so humble that he won't even stand up for himself. Any other injustice that he sees, he's going to intervene, he's going to speak up for people and so on, but not for himself. And that seems potentially troubling. So that's my first question, is to, how to distinguish humility from a kind of self-abnegation that gets in the way of standing up for oneself and indeed of being an agent altogether. My second question is how to distinguish humility from submission to something that isn't itself a rational factor in decision-making or belief formation. Now, in his great philosophical work, The Guide of the Perplexed, Maimonides makes an argument for belief in creation based on an acknowledgement of the limits of our knowledge. But it is itself a rather humble acknowledgement of the limits of our knowledge. He doesn't say we will never know any more about the cosmos than we do now. He says that he can't himself see how we can learn enough to figure out whether the world is created or eternal. And therefore, he says, we should submit to the traditional belief and say that it was created. Now, I'm not going to go into Maimonides' other reasons for saying that, but it seems potentially troubling because it seems as though intellectual humility is there serving as a sort of cover for submission to some other sort of authority. And I think that's the reason why one of Maimonides' closest readers, Spinoza, rejects the idea of humility altogether. So in part 4 of the Ethics, when he's discussing the virtues, in Proposition 53, Spinoza says that humility is not a virtue. It does not arise from reason. And he says instead, humility is a sadness which arises from the fact that a man considers his own lack of power. And I think Spinoza's picture there is that a virtue would have to come from some kind of positive self-understanding of one's own power, not from the mere recognition that one doesn't have a certain power at this point. Now, that raises all sorts of questions. Could there be a positive self-understanding that involves an understanding of one's limits? as opposed to a mere sadness that one hasn't figured something out. And I think that Kant, in particular, in the 18th century, is addressing that question. Kant tries to arrive at a critical method which involves a positive understanding of the human cognitive power. And it is the price that we must pay, Kant thinks, for our ability, our power to understand the physical world, that we must realize that there are certain kinds of knowledge we cannot have. And in particular, we cannot have knowledge of God and other great metaphysical, supersensible beings and ideas. So there, it's not just a sadness that, well, we haven't managed this yet, but it's a positive understanding of our power that leads to a recognition of our limits. And if that view is correct, then there would be a sort of an intellectual humility that is positive and not just a sad fact. But this too was seen to serve a kind of religious dogmatism, because at least some people, certainly within the church and also within Judaism at the time, took Kant's acknowledgement of the intellectual limits of our power as a way to reintroduce kind of dogmatism and say, well, in that case, you should listen to us and you should listen to tradition. Again, there may be positive reasons for listening to tradition, but I think that one would be right to be suspicious of this particular sort of argument. And I think it's therefore a question, as I say, how to distinguish intellectual humility from submission to something else that you may wonder whether that something else is in fact a rational factor. Now, Kant's successors, the German idealists, people like Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, I think partly for this reason, reject the Kantian critical method and the idea that a positive self-understanding leads to a sort of permanent settling of the limits of human cognition. Hegel famously says that something can be known as a limit only to the extent that one has already gone beyond it. So his thought is that as soon as you establish a limit, you do so from the other side, but then presumably you're already aspiring to turn that place where you're standing into a position of knowledge and power. So there isn't in principle any limit to human progress of the kind that Kant sought to draw. This is not obviously true. Wittgenstein famously tries to come up with his own critical method that allows us to determine limits not from the other side, but as he says in the Philosophical Investigations, from the bumps that the understanding gets from running its head up against the limits of language from the inside. And there may be a way to do that, in fact, with respect to the limits of language, for example, which is his topic. And I think my biggest worry there about the more optimistic sounding German idealist approach, the Hegelian approach, is that it can lead to a kind of intellectual arrogance, especially with respect to other disciplines. In the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel portrays modernity as an arena for a conflict between morality and science. On the one hand, modern morality pictures us as free agents with the ability to make judgments of conscience, and they will conflict with one another. On the other hand, modern science tries to achieve a kind of unanimity, but in a way that seems to portray human beings as incapable of being those sorts of agents, as being rather the objects of study for whose determining laws we seek. Hegel imagines a reconciliation between science and morality, between those two different aspects of modernity, in which, following a religious model, and particularly a Christian version of it, each renounces its own claim to absoluteness. Religion and, morality and science each renounce their claim to absoluteness, but they do so, of course, under the aegis of philosophy, which thereby precisely makes its claim to absolute knowing. And that's my third question, as to whether we can imagine a kind of conversation born out of humility, where each of us renounces our own claim to absoluteness without at the same time rendering some other human being or human discipline a representative of divine authority, which has absoluteness and then can serve as the referee. So those are the three questions that I wanted to raise. How can we distinguish humility from self-abnegation? How can we distinguish humility from submission to something non-rational? And can we have humble conversation without installing somebody or some discipline as arrogating to itself the authority to referee between us?
Great, thank you, Paul, for that really rich presentation. We're going to move now to our second presenter, Reverend Kobi Little. Reverend Little is an SNF Agora Visiting Fellow this year. He's the Dean of the Justice Chapel and serves as the President of the Baltimore NAACP and Vice President and Political Action Chairman of the Maryland State Conference of the NAACP. His current work explores the theory and practice of the prophetic ministry tradition and their implications for democracy building, justice advocacy, and equity advancement. I should also mention he's a graduate of Johns Hopkins, where he was active as an undergraduate in the Black Student Union and the university's NAACP chapter.
Good morning, Dean. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this conversation. I'm delighted to meet the other panelists, and I'm looking very much forward to learning and thinking about the ideas that are shared here today. There's so much ground to cover, but I'd like to start with the thought. Well, I approach this conversation both as a theologian and a practicing minister, as well as a voting rights advocate and one who would like to think that he works to strengthen democracy. So those are my points of departure. I'd like to start the conversation by offering the idea that intellectual humility is an academic expression of love. Intellectual humility is an academic expression of love. And for me, that's important because love is that concept, that idea, that force that I believe keeps us together, is the most sustainable platform for human interaction, and what will open our eyes to all of the possibilities surrounding humility. I think that respect is an expression of love, and humility is an expression of respect. Having said that, I also believe that intellectual humility is a breach to and a trust of democracy. Humility allows us to see other people, to value other people. And so for those who believe in democracy, the concept of collective governance, those who believe in human rights, I think it's also necessary for us to see the value in intellectual humility. Now, as Paul has already laid out to some degree, the antithesis of intellectual humility is intellectual arrogance. And intellectual arrogance is a challenge to the pursuit of truth. Intellectual arrogance, as we have witnessed over the last at least 20 years in the United States, erodes trust. Intellectual arrogance ends up undermining democracy. And I think that it's important for us to kind of tease out why intellectual arrogance is so prevalent on this planet, particularly in democracies, when intellectual arrogance seems to be antithetical to democracy. And I'd offer that there are at least two reasons that are connected, but also independent. The first, I think, will approach from the individual level, and that is to say that people are arrogant because of their insecurities. People are arrogant because of fear, and people are arrogant because they seek to dominate other people. And you know, I think that the other kind of point of departure where we see intellectual arrogance is at the societal level. And for very many of the same reasons that individuals exhibit intellectual arrogance, we see societies exhibit intellectual arrogance. There is some sense of insecurity. There is a need to be better. There is a desire to impose hegemony, and there is fear. And I think it's incumbent upon us who believe in democracy, those of us who believe in democracy, to draw on the wisdom of you know, our faith traditions. And certainly, as Paul has mentioned, the Abrahamic traditions do place a premium on humility. Certainly in the Christian context, there is a large emphasis on wisdom, knowledge, and humility, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Micah 6:8 says, "He's shown you, O human, what is required of you, to love justice, to do mercy, and to walk humbly with God." The New Testament says that we must show ourselves students rightly dividing the word of God, or rightly pursuing knowledge. I would just take a point of variance. In the Christian tradition, the idea that all knowledge of God is never accessible is not quite accurate. The scriptures say that now we see darkly, now we don't know, but in due time, all of this knowledge will be revealed to us. And you know, on the question of whether or not, or on the question of the limitations or the ways that science, philosophy, and theology somehow contradict each other or are incompatible, I really think that this is just a function of intellectual arrogance. This is a desire for the proponents in those fields or those disciplines to exert hegemony or to show superiority. And this superiority point is a very big threat to democracy. What we know from science, what we know from religion, and what some theories of philosophy show us is that our ecosystems thrive when we have diversity. And in the absence of diversity, we don't do so well. But the impulse of intellectual arrogance, the impulse to exert power and dominion over others, the impulse to deny the validity of others' views and experiences, certainly limits our ability to have a functioning democracy. So I think I'll stop there. But I would like to just speak to the point of confidence versus arrogance. I think that it is very possible to be humble and to also be confident in your knowledge and not cross the line into arrogance. So I don't think that humility necessarily equates to a lack of self-confidence or submission. I think that we can be humble, have confidence in what we believe, and still allow for other ideas. It's kind of like a family of children, 3 children. First child, the second child, and the third child, each experience their parents in different ways. And if we were to ask them to describe their parents, they would describe their parents in different ways. And yet, they would still be talking about the same 2 people. And I think the challenge is for us to see the compatibility of theology, science, and philosophy, and perhaps art, in the same way. Perhaps each of these disciplines are describing phenomena, the same phenomena, but using different languages and describing them from different vantage points. We always do better when we are able to embrace diversity and to see others' right to have different views, and also allow for the possibility that others' views can also manifest the truth.
Great, thank you, Reverend Little. We're glad to see we're already getting a conversation going between you and Paul, and we're going to return to all those questions after our next 2 presenters speak. So next up is Sarah Rushing. She's an associate professor of political science at Montana State University and the author of The Virtues of Vulnerability, Humility, Autonomy, and Citizen Subjectivity. Her background is in feminist theory and contemporary political thought, and her current research focuses on virtue and ethics, particularly conceptions of humility and autonomy in contexts of birth, illness, death, and grief. We're so glad she can join us from across the country, Montana, to discuss her work on humility.
Thank you so much for having me. And I would just start by saying I am one of 3 children, and I now have 3 children, and I can confirm that what you say, Reverend Little, is exactly true. And it makes for a productive and ongoing engagement that is hopefully confident but not arrogant. So thank you so much for having me this morning. Hello from Montana. I'm going to tell a bit more of a personal story about how I came to engage with humility and how it's traveled through my work, because my work, I think, is quite different from what we've heard about so far, and I'll just add to the conceptual vocabulary we're working with today. So my interest in humility began in 2008 during the summer when I was fortunate to participate in a National Endowment for the Humanities summer seminar on virtue ethics and Confucianism at Wesleyan University. So at the time, I was engaged in ongoing work on Judith Butler's philosophy, particularly her return to ethics, and her exploration of whose lives are grievable. And I was thinking a lot about how and why we should cultivate dispositions of generosity, humility, and restraint so as to navigate our all too human vulnerabilities and desubjugating experiences of grief, as well as our destructive, if self-protective impulses to domination, forced closure, and political disavowal of others with whom we disagree, which Reverend Little has just made me think about in terms of the will to have the final word, right? So a deep dive into the Analects convinced me that humility was a foundational component of Confucius's political theory too, and perhaps counterintuitively, that his text opened up a way to think about a non-theological and deeply relational conception of humility that was of value for collectively self-determining participatory democratic citizens in a way that the traditional Christian conception, in my humble opinion, is not. I was also drawn to Confucian humility because the Analects is all about the very concrete practices we undertake to cultivate this disposition. So practices of learning and reflecting, of proper self-assessment, and of recognizing the role of fate, or what we might call our historicity, how it plays in our lives and our ability to carry out our aims. So I like to joke that my work is the strange love child of a heated affair between Confucius and Judith Butler, as much as that makes sense to anyone but me. So as I progressed in my thinking about humility as a political virtue for democratic citizens, I soon came to realize that humility, though important and potentially empowering, is one side of a coin, the other side of which is autonomy. And my recent book, as Dean noted, is called The Virtues of Vulnerability, Humility, autonomy, and citizen subjectivity. And in that project, I ultimately developed what I describe as a cluster concept of humility-informed relational autonomy. And I've taken to calling this in my head and now in a few printed places, Hera, who I at some point want to work up as a figure and tell her story. Maybe the lost Greek goddess of humility. So when I look at Confucian political theory for my conception of humility, I turned to feminist relational autonomy theory for my conception of autonomy. And in a nutshell, relational autonomy sees autonomy as a process and a project and an always precarious achievement. This approach treats autonomy not as a matter of non-interference, so leave me alone and get out of my way and I am free, but as a product of a thick set of conditions and relations that help a person develop what the philosopher Diana Myers calls autonomy competencies. And so in my book, I argue kind of the main intellectual contribution, I think, is to argue humility needs autonomy as a realm of freedom we can identify and pursue despite never being truly independent. Without such autonomy in the form of supported self-direction, which feminist theorists call relational autonomy, humility would be merely a consolation for relative impotence. But autonomy also needs humility, because autonomy is not a one-time achievement. It's an ongoing and fragile process. It's a project of claiming over and over our lives as our own. And we need both humility and autonomy as citizens striving for collective self-determination with, or possibly, and at least public discourse indicates frequently at odds with, other members of our diverse and increasingly polarized polity. As the title of my book indicates, I'm also really interested in thinking about how we develop what I call citizen subjectivity, a way of being in power and knowledge relationships that's defined by an impulse towards participation, a recognition of the value of self-definition and self-determination, a belief in one's deservingness of meaningful participation and inclusion, and a critical scrutiny of any suggestions to the contrary, particularly when those suggestions include subordinating moves masked or facilitated by knowledge claims. So you don't have a right to meaningful participation because you are X, Y, or Z, right? Finally, as a political theorist with a capacious conception of the political and someone who takes Foucault seriously, the context that my book focuses on is a site we tend to treat as personal and private, but which I argue is very political and often quite public, namely the clinic. So I explore how we cultivate and rely on humility-informed relational autonomy as we navigate extreme experiences of bodily vulnerability when we undergo childbirth, as Dean mentioned in introducing my project, childbirth, navigate death and dying, and seek treatment for illness within mainstream American medical institutions. So what I call the medical legal policy insurance nexus, or what the sociologist Wendy Simons calls hospital land USA, or others call the medical industrial complex. So I'm really interested in the clinic as a site where we actually, whether we know it or not, or want it or not, end up being exposed to opportunities to cultivate citizen subjectivity, citizenship traits, agency, self-determination. So in the book, the context I explore to consider illness is the Veterans Administration mental health system, and how veterans seeking treatment for PTSD navigate that institution and its limited sanctioned treatment options. And I should note that the questions I grapple with in this book are really personal questions to me. I became fascinated in the power knowledge matrix of the clinic, and it's the desire to navigate it with agency and intention, or what I call in the book choice and control, through my own experiences of childbirth, and in helping my brother navigate the psychiatric world when he was struggling with severe mental illness before committing suicide in 2001. So I had a very personal stake in this book, both as a political theorist and someone interested in putting traditions into dialogue, but also as a human being who lived through these experiences, wanted to think at a different level about what they mean for us as people. So I want to pause here and acknowledge that I'm not sure the conception of a humility I work with in my book is intellectual humility exactly, though it certainly reflects a lot of thinking about how we relate to our knowledge, our own knowledge, as well as official bodies of knowledge that carry a lot of power, and which we might find ourselves both having to scrutinize and trust at the same time. And I think that is the nature of encountering medical expertise as it's put into practice in the clinic as treatment. We both have to scrutinize it, we're invited to scrutinize it, but we're also dependent on it and have to trust it all at once. And that can be very disorienting for patients. And I want to make an argument that that kind of disorientation is actually an experience citizens have in the polity proper all the time, both to scrutinize and have to trust. So as I see it, the dominant logic of the clinic that kind of invites both that scrutiny and trust, that autonomy and that humility, we might say, is what I characterize as a lingering benevolent paternalism of that traditional medical framework, this lingering benevolent paternalism that overlaps with neoliberal ideas about patient autonomy, empowerment, and responsibility. And so within the traditional paternalist framework, the patient is the one who humbly and patiently receives the treatment deemed good for them by the all-knowing medical authority. And within the contemporary neoliberal framework, on the other hand, the patient is an active participant in their care, a savvy information consumer, a rational, autonomous choice maker. So a citizen patient in a complex relationship to power, knowledge, vulnerability, and the desire for control over situations that are often not neatly controllable. So I don't know if that's intellectual humility. For me, humility comes about through practice and always first and foremost at the site of the body, as it comes into contact with and subjects us to the world, and different bodies encounter and are subjected to the world in different ways. If I was going to show a slide as part of this talk, I would show the slide I often show mostly in teaching context of a whole array of bodies that do not conform to the traditional norm of the body, and to think about how those people encounter the world, including women, including poor people, gay people, people of color, and also how they encounter the world in the clinic, which is really empirically documented, that their experience is often quite disparate from the traditional, rational, autonomous white man who navigates the clinic. So I want to end by raising a question Dean and I discussed the other day when we were chatting about this panel, which is, what does the term intellectual add to the idea of humility? Or how does it importantly change how we think and talk about humility? And maybe we can return to that in our discussion. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And I should also just remind the attendees that the Q&A function is down at the bottom of your screens, and feel free to type a question in there at any time, and we will get to those later on, along with all the other questions that our panelists have already raised. Okay, so finally, Andrew Perrin. Andrew Perrin is the SNF Agora Institute Professor of Sociology in the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences. He is a cultural and political sociologist working on issues of democracy, including civic engagement, effects of higher education, and public deliberation. He is author or co-author of 5 books, including American Democracy, From Tocqueville to Town Halls to Twitter. I should also mention he just recently joined Johns Hopkins, coming from UNC, where he chaired a multi-year review and redesign of the undergraduate curriculum and employed the notion of intellectual humility there. So yes, Andrew Perrin.
Thank you so much, Dean. Thanks also for my co-panelists who have set this up so wonderfully. I think this conversation is just terrific. So thank you. And thanks for the invitation. And in particular, Sarah, you ended with the question I was going to start with. So that's just terrific. What is it that's intellectual about intellectual humility, and how should we engage this? And I should say that I really started to engage or think with the question of intellectual humility through the process that Dean mentioned, in which I led a multi-year process to redesign the general education curriculum for UNC Chapel Hill undergrads, which should or is expected to go into effect next fall. And I encountered this as a sort of a measurement term in the ed psych world, and started to think, because as I am essentially a sociological theorist, started to think about what intellectual humility might mean conceptually, working from this sort of educational psychology conception of it, which is essentially the tendency to think and believe that one might be wrong, and the ability to work with the conception that and deal and manage with the conception that one might be wrong. And so I'm coming at this perhaps from a different entry point from those that have been discussed before, and yet I think really complementary one. I want to start, though, I'll circle back around to the curricular question, because I do think it's a really important one. But I want to start talking about intellectual humility in this sort of pragmatic register, as a key disciplining mechanism for two things that I think I care a lot about, and I think all of us care a lot about. And those things are science and democracy. And so in plain terms, if we think that intellectual humility is accepting the possibility that one might be wrong and then being willing to work with that possibility, we can first see science as practice, and this is a curricular point too, science as practice, not as outcome, as essentially institutionally organized intellectual humility. That is that what scientists do, and importantly, not how science is usually taught or communicated, but what scientists do in the laboratory is to carefully discipline themselves with respect to the possibility that they might be wrong, right? This goes back certainly to the Popperian notion that what we're doing in science is seeking to falsify beliefs that we hold, right? So organized intellectual humility, and then the practice of hypothesis testing and rejecting is essentially a practice of trying to figure out how likely it is that the theory that we hold is wrong. There's a curricular point to this as well that I'll circle back around to. The combined piece, and this touches as well on the prior conversation, that goes to the question of democracy, is that for various kinds of political theory, various strains, there's a widespread understanding and agreement that democratic engagement, democratic citizenship requires some kind of sublimation. I use this psychoanalytic term in part also due to Judith Butler, but that democracy requires some kind of sublimation, that is, some sense that one is able and willing to forego the short-term pleasurability of action in favor of the possibility of a longer-term outcome or a longer-term productivity. And we get this in widely varying pieces of democratic theory. For example, even in game theory, right, the reason why groups are willing to participate in the democratic process, even if they're likely to lose, is either because they expect in the future to be able to win, or because the costs of losing are reduced because of their participation in that system, right? So across widely varying pieces of political theory, we understand that it's important for people to be willing to be wrong, to submit ideas and questions to evidence, and to accept the possibility of loss because of the possibility of longer-term gains are possible. Now, a couple things that this brings up, both in science and in democracy, and certainly in the interplay between science and democracy. These are all premised on the possibility, the recognition that the willingness to accept loss requires some kind of cushion or surplus. That is, if loss is existential, if the possibility of losing in the political arena actually means death, misrecognition, exclusion, then it is not possible. It's not rational and certain and not possible to accept the possibility of loss when one is essentially backed up against a wall, right? When loss is an existential threat. And the contemporary public sphere actually affords all sorts of struggles that certainly seem and maybe are existential, and therefore don't really afford that generosity, that surplus that's available, is necessary to accept the possibility of loss. So I'm a sociologist. I basically think that most things are caused by the environments, social environments in which they take place. And I think the social environment of the contemporary public sphere is one in which it's very difficult to practice intellectual humility, because that long-term payoff is made to seem too costly or too unlikely, for the short-term cost. I would say, if we, when people say to me, oh, you're an Institute for Democracy, isn't that a historical fiction or something like that? And I say, well, yes, I think there are a couple of grand social threats right now that threaten democracy. And the two that I raise, number one is climate change, right, is a grand social threat that threatens the capacity for democracy to succeed. And number two is the vast material inequality combined with low chances for social mobility that change the likelihood that people are willing to accept loss, that is, that they're able to engage in intellectual humility. Both of these increase existential threat. The stakes of losing, if we say that willingness to accept loss depends on this surplus and the stakes of losing aren't all that high, but we actually don't want them to be too low either, right? That I think actually the mistake of public discourse from maybe 1970 to at least 2008 and potentially through the present is the cordoning off of public life as being areas where the stakes don't really matter, and it's an area for professionals in politics to kind of niggle over the details. And that, I think, is part and parcel of this sense of disconnection that plagues the public sphere. So you want the stakes to be pretty high. You want inclusion to be really broad, but you don't want it to be so high, right, that one can't engage in intellectual humility. Okay. Now, circle back around. I mentioned these curricular questions, and one interesting point, Sunshine Hilligus, political scientist at Duke, has discovered in a cool little article that the only area in which when students take more courses in the area, they're actually less likely to be good citizens after college is science and technology. If they're taking these highly vaunted STEM classes, the more such classes students take, the less likely they are to do basic kinds of good citizenship outcomes after college. And my graduate student, Alana Gillis, and I did some statistical work to confirm that this is true with as much controls as we were able to do in the process. So what is it about STEM education, if we think that actually this intellectual humility is a sciencey thing, and that it ought to actually provide a foundation for good democratic citizenship? I think the answer is we teach science really badly. We teach science badly, certainly at the high school level, and I think, in fact, at the undergraduate level as well. That is, we teach students to discover things that are already known, that there is a right answer, and that right answer is concrete, and it's, the word I'll use is self-executing. Its meaning is outside of dispute. If indeed we were to switch, and some of my former colleagues like Kelly Hogan and Vijay Sathi at UNC are working exactly on this question. If we were to teach students science as process, that is, science as organized intellectual humility, I think indeed we could create a much better kind of political subjectivity. That is, it's not all going to be about science. We'll get to the rest of the curricular innovations in a second, but that science is actually an opportunity for us to help create subjects who are better at recognizing and working with their own possibility that they're wrong. What we did with the Ideas in Action curriculum at UNC, I'm super proud of it. I'm thrilled that it's going to be implemented. Was we tried to actually abstract away from the disciplines. The disciplines are the route through which we ask students to achieve capacities, and those capacities are about asking great questions, amassing and using evidence to address those questions, coming to good judgments even in the context of incomplete and unclear evidence, and acting upon those judgments in a responsible, thoughtful way. And so an intellectual humility is one of the core concepts we use to think about this cycle and to ask our faculty actually to twist around a bit and understand the content of their teaching in the service of the general education curriculum as helping to give students those kinds of foundations that we believe and hope that they're able to use across lots of different kinds of post-college roles, from good citizenship to intellectual habits of mind, and yes, to adequate and good employment success, whether it's in the marketplace as well. A couple of quick notes to point out that I've written down. I got the pleasure of being last, which means I get to think about things that the rest of y'all have talked about. One is that humility can't just be denigration. I appreciated Sarah's point that that it needs to be about being able to do a better job of taking action. And so humility is not just, oh, I'm wrong, I better sit in the corner. but rather it's, I might be wrong. Let me subject my action and my understanding to sort of careful self-critique. So it needs to be the foundation for better action, not the foundation for inaction. And I also wanted to point out that I mentioned above the vast inequalities in the public that I think are the big thing, at least domestically, that threatens the public sphere. And let's recognize that different kinds of people are taught differentially that they might be wrong throughout their childhoods and early socialization, right? So the idea that one might be wrong may come much more easily to some folks than to others, but also may also be more and less important to the formation of a responsible, thoughtful political subjectivity. Again, based on the differential sort of lifetime experiences of folks encountering this process. Thanks again to all of you for this great conversation. I'm really looking forward to it.
Great, thank you. And we'll now have a sort of conversation among the panelists. And I mean, I'm a little bit wary of moderating too much. There's been so many questions already posed, and I sort of am tempted to just say, discuss. That's probably not wise from an organizational point of view. So I'll maybe just, sort of reformulate a few things that have been said and throw it back to you all. I mean, maybe to go back to the metaphor that Reverend Little introduced about the three children. I mean, I think that ties into what Andrew Perrin was just saying about the relation of the sciences to other sorts of, claims to knowledge. And I wonder, maybe Reverend Little, if you want to sort of start off by elaborating sort of how we can get that metaphor to work, to the idea that there are a diverse set of kind of perspectives, if you will, on one and the same reality, and that it's kind of fear that keeps us from being able to acknowledge that they can all sort of coexist and be in dialogue with each other. And I just sort of, maybe you could say a little bit more about how you think, sort of what resources we have to sort of encourage this view that there are different modes of approaching it and they don't have to be in contrast to each other. And then if you want to go first, and then I'll open that back up to others.
Well, Dean, I'd love to jump right in. I want to thank Andrew, Sarah, and Paul for very provocative presentations. I'm challenged by the frame of this conversation, though, that I think that we have built as the program has progressed. I find it to be a little too dichotomous or binary. Intellectual humility, yes, it can mean that we allow for us being wrong, but more importantly, intellectual humility allows for the fact that we don't know. It allows for the fact that others can be right. And it allows for the fact that multiple expressions of the truth can exist at the same time. And for me, this is such an important point. And I didn't say it outright in my opening remarks, and Sarah kind of touched on it. While there are many possibilities for why intellectual arrogance can exist, the reason it exists today is because of white supremacy. And Andrew, I would proffer that the real existential threat to democracy and to a continued pursuit of knowledge and understanding is white supremacy. It is white supremacy that has produced the cultural and economic inequality that we experience today. Now, theoretically, there are lots of things that could produce that. But the very real reason why there is global inequality today on this planet is because of white supremacy. The very real reason why we are facing such a monumental climate crisis, I believe, I would offer, is white supremacy. Because the white supremacist urge to subvert and to subjugate other people, coupled with the urge to operate in a world of superlatives, to operate in a world of dominion, means that the planet and humanity as a social organism have been thrown out of balance, right? You can't have balance if you have domination. And so I'd like to challenge us to also talk a little bit about the very real reasons why this conversation is so relevant now. Like, how is it that this year we have seen an implosion of what has been purported to be the greatest democracy in the history of the world, and simultaneously seen an explosion, a public health explosion, that puts all of humanity at risk of an extinction event. And what I would offer is that the lack of humility and the lack of intellectual humility, and I interpret intellectual humility not so much intellectual modifying humility, but humility modifying intellectual. You know, we have, as a country, and I say we very loosely, have prevented the intellectual exploration of what democracy is. We have been a neo-colonial empire from day one and claim that we are also a democracy. We have been a capitalist country, which places primacy on profit and then the firm over people, while at the same time claiming that we are a democracy which places primacy on people. And somehow we have been able to convince ourselves that we're a democracy and also convince other people that we're a democracy. So I will wrap my response to everything that I heard up with these two thoughts. There's a question in the chat about humility beyond intellectual humility. And I think the value of humility, especially in light of the things that Andrew said, is that humility actually protects our ego. We don't experience an existential loss if we're wrong, because we accept that we can be wrong. And humility protects our relationships, and it protects our capacity as a society to be resilient. And so I think humility is what keeps us alive in some sense. So I'll stop there. I probably have said a lot, maybe too much, and I look forward to your responses.
Yes, sir.
Sorry, I know you said we didn't have to raise our hands, but I'm the timing of Zoom always makes me talk over people, so I'm cautious about it. I think your comments, Reverend Lindo, are so good, and I take, when Andrew talks about, the existential threat, that largely the existential threat we're experiencing today and have been in the whole history of our country is the one posed by white supremacy, where some people's actual existences are at threat and other people's existences as dominant are at threat. That's the, I think, threat today. And once you're in this stoked context of existential threat, it's pitched as a zero-sum game. And I think that's what you were getting at, Andrew, in terms of how discourse has functioned in the last 10 or 15 years. It's really been pitched as a zero-sum game. So once you're into this context of a zero-sum game, intellectual humility strikes me as really impossible, because the way in which you're encountering the other is so already fraught. So I guess the question that then takes me back to, because part of, I want to think about humility as a disposition of strength that does help us be resilient, that does help us have humor before our humanness, right? I like to kind of bundle those together. That helps us understand that, like, we're thrown into history, we're thrown into a body, and there are limits on what we can do. And we can either beat ourselves up for that, or we can laugh before the sort of bigness of it all, and go forward the best we can. But also I take humility as being particularly important in how we conduct ourselves in relation to others that we do see as a threat and that we nonetheless have to keep working with. So I guess what I want to ask, following up on your comments and how they wove together some of the other comments here, is then how does this go back to your initial statement that humility is, or intellectual humility is an academic expression of love? Because I think what it's really impossible to pitch to people who have traditionally been subordinated, although Christianity, I think, makes this argument, is that you should love the other nonetheless. And I feel like when you're in a context of existential threat that is pitched as a zero-sum game, meaning some people's survival is at the cost of others, I don't see how intellectual humility can work there, and I don't see how love can work there.
Yeah, I don't,
Yeah.
Reverend Little, go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you. I would offer that love is that sentiment, that concept that can be or should be that sentiment or concept that causes us to get up every morning, want to work together, want to continue to exist. Self-love should lead to a desire for self-perpetuation and a love of others, which rivals or exceeds our self-love, ought to drive us to produce for the greater good and for those who follow after us. And so to the extent that we engage in academic pursuit for something other than contemplating our own navel, to the extent that we engage in academic pursuit to produce knowledge that enables us to perpetuate ourselves, to improve our qualities of life, to prepare a better world for the next generations, then perhaps that explains it. If it doesn't, I welcome you to push me back, or we could continue the conversation offline, because I do think it's important. I don't mean a mushy romantic love. I mean an abiding appreciation and respect for self and for the collective.
Maybe, thank you for that. Maybe I can turn this back to Paul Franks too, who had sort of mentioned that, raised this question about, what it means, humility means in these faith traditions where you're in the service of a sort of transcendent God, and if there's a way to kind of bring the virtue down to the more sort of post-enlightenment context. And it seems like relevant to this question of how in this sort of pluralistic society in which we find ourselves, how humility and love can be, found or fostered.
Well, at the extent of being expelled from all of Christendom, I will say today that I think the greatest common denominator for understanding God is that God is love. And so whether you, adopt a religious tradition or not, the phenomena of love is a reality in the human experience. And so whether you use French or English or Italian or Swahili or Korean to describe it, or if you use Christianity or Islam or any number of other religions to describe it, love is still a human phenomenon. And so I guess that's, I don't think that religion ought to be a point of dissension or division. As I offered earlier, I think that religion and science often describe the same phenomena using different terms and a different point of departure.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, I think that I'd like to think that it's still possible to draw in a positive way on faith traditions for political purposes. I'm also aware that that is often not what works, and it's often divisive. And I'm also thinking about the fact that in modern society, science has taken at least part, and that's certainly not all, but part of the role that religion used to play as an authoritative source within society. So I'm wondering about, just to throw something else into the mix and to connect up some of the previous comments, how are we to think about the current pandemic in terms of the impact of scientific and medical decision-making on people's autonomy? I think a lot of our popular discourse about the pandemic is generated by a lack of understanding, and this goes back to what Andrew Barron was saying as well, about how science operates. And I think a lot of people in the United States have found it very confusing that, one day you'll see a newspaper report that says masks are effective, the next day you'll see that they're not, and so on. And dealing with the way in which scientific knowledge is acquired, the way in which apparently authoritative views change, I think that's been immensely confusing to people. And I think some of that really does have to do with the lack of good science education. And I'd like to hear more about how to fix that problem as well. I think that's really become a huge political problem for us, in addition to the fact that, as we were discussing before, on the one hand, demographic change is perceived as an existential threat because of white supremacy, even though it's also an effect of white supremacy and inequality. On the other hand, climate change, which really is an existential threat, is not perceived as an existential threat for similar reasons. All of this is very troubling, and it seems to me very connected to the issue about a very inadequate understanding of the scientific process within American society in particular.
This might be a good place to throw in, it's more of a comment than a question from one of our attendees, David. Quote, "I may be wrong, but I'm never in doubt," end quote. As a doctor, I've joked about that often, so I'm very sensitive to the power dynamics in the doctor-patient relationship. And I know, Sarah, that's something you've written about more from the perspective of the patient than the doctor, but doctors too, and scientists are sort of caught up in this whole nexus of knowledge production and power. So maybe, Andrew, if you want to respond briefly, maybe just say a little bit more about the question of science education. And then we're also getting some more questions in the Q&A, and we can begin to turn to some more of those.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, no, I'll turn to science education in a sec, but I wanted to just say I accept Reverend Little's point that the sort of organization of domination via white supremacy is probably the major contributor to the level of existential threat that populates the public sphere. And so I don't disagree with his naming of it in that way. I do think, though, that its experience now transcends, which is not to say it's not related to, but it transcends the question of white supremacy, such that people's experience of existential threat in many cases is rationally experienced outside the realm of white supremacy per se, and it's experienced as economic existential threat. And this great insight from Sudhir Venkatesh's ethnography, in which a cocaine dealer is posed the question of, would you take price X for your cocaine right now or twice the price for it in a week? And he says, I'll take the price for it right now because the bet on the future is so unsure. And so the point of this is that the surplus that's available for intellectual humility is really diminished when the conditions in which people make those decisions are so fraught and so emergent. And so I agree that white supremacy is probably the major player in creating that moment. On the question of science education, my colleague and I have been writing a book on the question of evidence in the public sphere, and I did an extended sort of writing exercise on the sign that I suspect many of us have seen in front yards that say, in this house, we believe Black Lives Matter, love is love. And then somewhere in this list, in this sort of creedal document that is the sign, we get the phrase, science is real. And so I've been trying to figure out what we do with the number one, the fact that we believe science is real is an interesting problematic. What the real means in this particular rhetoric, and the fact that, in fact, I think this statement is actually self-destructive. It destroys its own position, because in stating itself as a creedal belief, that is, I believe science is the truth, which is what I think what real means in this case, you're actually warranting the possibility that someone else might believe that science is not the truth, that it's actually in the realm of contest. So what I think we ought to be doing with science education is actually teaching science as a process of self-doubt. Right, that does a couple of things. One, it opens science into an active process of investigation and curiosity and asking great questions. It raises the possibility of bringing science to areas that are not understood as scientific. So bringing that sort of same organized self-doubt to social questions, to humanistic questions. And it also lets people think with evidence. That is, think with things that are outside their own experience, but to do so in a way that is not absolute and dispositive, right? And I think that's actually, I remember talking to one of my colleagues at UNC about this, that many science graduate students arrive even at graduate school thinking they're going to become scientists and thinking that it's going to be essentially a transparent process of discovery. I'm going to find a material, I'm going to find a molecule, I'm going to find a physical process. And they actually have to unlearn science as they learned it in college, even at great colleges, because they've never learned that, in fact, what science is mostly about is asking the question in a complicated way and carefully doubting every step along that way. So I think my answer is, I think science education ought to teach science as process of organized self-doubt, much more than as discovery. And I think that will really help also with intellectual humility more generally.
Great, thank you for that. Maybe I'll just read a question that's related to that. I think David from Cleveland says, humility, to the extent it is viewed as a tool to empathy, can be conceived to necessarily involve an oscillatory self-abnegation and submission to the other. In the context of intellectual humility as a tool to interdisciplinary harmony and intellectual growth, the necessary oscillations may be an awareness of the possibilities one is wrong, and that the approaches or disciplines of others may have unique value and unique validity. Yeah, so I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that. I mean, the question of humility as a personal virtue versus, in a way, humility as a virtue of a practice or a whole discipline or a whole school of arts and sciences. I mean, those are all really interesting questions. Yes, Sarah.
Maybe I will open up more on that question by this comment, which I do think links to it and also goes back to the question you read before, that I may be wrong, but I'm never in doubt as a doctor. And I don't want to comment so much on medical knowledge in this response, but it really does make me think that the whole debate on intellectual humility has to be contextualized in terms of thinking about the costs of being wrong, and that or the costs of doubt. And that in our society, the cost of doubt has gotten very high because conviction has taken such an important role in sort of staunching people against attack. And, I think about two examples I talk to my students about when Stephen Colbert was invited early in his career to roast George Bush at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And he said, Bush, everyone loves George Bush because he's a man of conviction. He believes the same thing on Wednesday that he believed on Monday, no matter what happened on Tuesday. Right. And that makes George Bush sound like an idiot, which was not, that was a popular thing to do. I think the other end of the political spectrum, when John Kerry was running for president, Tucker Carlson had a whole running joke about how John Kerry was French because he thought too much. He just thought, and they'd show him in his little black beret, and they doctored up these funny pictures. And the point was that he was too philosophical and kind of effeminate because he couldn't just make a decision. He spent a lot of time doubting whether what he knew was the right way to go. So I think both those things really point to this question of like how much room is there for doubt and for being wrong? We're all educators, but I think, or many of us are educators or working in an academic context. I think one of the things we see with our students is this, at least I do, this terrible fear of being wrong. And because the costs seem very high. So I think it's hard to talk about intellectual humility without talking directly about the question of doubt. And also, I think, just to throw one more idea into the mix, the question of shame. I was talking to my students last week about how often Socrates talks about shame, and one student said, is shame ever useful? And we sort of settled on this idea that shame might have a useful sort of self-disciplining function when you're already a really psychically strong person. Then a little shame is probably beneficial. But if you're not already really psychically strong, shame is probably kind of decimating. And I think that's the same thing with the sort of being exposed as wrong, right? So I don't know how that kind of complicates it, but maybe, to weave in the question you raised, Dean, and the comment you made, Andrew, that it has to be sort of incorporated in some to our intellectual practices to teach these dispositions, right?
Great, thank you. Our panelists have other comments on these related issues. There's a couple more questions I want to get to, but Paul, I see you're unmuted. Is that?
Well, I was just going to say, I think we're in an unprecedented moment in human history because of the internet as well. In a way, information has never been more accessible. You can access vast amounts of bits of information, but without the education in self-critical thinking that allows you to determine which is a reliable source, which is an unreliable source, and to engage in a process where you actually try to falsify your own beliefs and try to criticize them rather than trying to find some bit of information out there that will support you in what you already think. This has created actually a very chaotic situation politically. And I wonder, again, what we can do educationally about that.
Well, I certainly agree with you, Paul. I think one of the challenges, we run the risk of shaming people when we say that people don't embrace science because they don't have a good science education. But I do agree that what is probably most helpful is that we shift that we, one, teach people critical thinking, but two, that we shift the emphasis from the importance of being right to the importance of understanding, or the importance of gaining and accessing knowledge. And I think that we have, fallen short on that over and over again. This is an interesting conversation. I want to lead in this way and say that, and to acknowledge that, the structures of religion have failed humanity over and over and over again. And to the extent that religion has very meaningful things to offer to humanity, those things have been jeopardized by the ways that the institutions and people who have led religions have failed. But it's also true for science. And so, what we have learned during the course of the pandemic is that the most effective communications begin with, we don't know what we don't know. And with an ability to say, when a question is posed, I don't know. We have seen the question of vaccine hesitance remain in the forefront because one, because of the betrayal of the scientific community. The scientific community has betrayed communities of color for centuries, one. But two, a lack of intellectual humility has allowed representatives of the scientific community to stand before the public and say things like, if you're vaccinated, you won't get infected. And as soon as somebody gets infected who has been vaccinated, then it casts a cloud of doubt over everything else the scientists have said. And it's just that little lack of intellectual humility. Instead of saying, what the research shows us is that this will be highly effective, and just leaving it at that. But the desire to be right and to be supreme actually puts us all in jeopardy. And there are countless examples in science and philosophy and academia, and certainly in the public square. And it's why our democracy is under such a great threat now. You know, there's really just not enough time in 90 minutes to talk about all this, but Sarah brought up George Bush. It was the anti-intellectualism of the George Bush era that brought us to the narcissism of the Trump era, which has led to the implosion of democracy that I spoke of and the explosion of this public health crisis. And that's why, my friends, I believe that the existential threat is failing to adopt intellectual humility.
Great, thank you. I'm going to just read two questions because we were talking about sources, and we have two questions which quote scripture here, and I'll just read both of them and then open it back up for our last, I guess, round of discussion. Nick says, what if we perceive Christianity not from the white European dominance instantiation, and instead from its historical perspective of self-sacrificing love by the triune king who stepped from a position of power to shame and sacrifice? Could Philippians 2 help us to think differently about humility and love? And then Karen writes, one of my favorite episodes in the Hebrew Bible is Genesis 18, 16 to 33, where Abraham pleads for Sodom. Before Abraham speaks with God, he says, though I am nothing but dust and ashes, I presume to speak to my Lord. This seems a beautiful example of how humility can be distinguished from self-abnegation. I wonder whether there are similar examples in the Christian or Confucian traditions. So yes, Sarah, you brought up in your book that drew on the Confucian tradition. Maybe you want to have a shot at this, and then we can ask for others.
Yeah, I mean, I think because the Confucian tradition put so much emphasis on self-assessment, proper self-assessment, it is, to me, it just has a fundamentally different tone than the way I hear the biblical passages. And also because of the way it comes through these little, sayings that you have to sort of do some interpretive work on. But, a classic example I like to point out is Confucius saying, whenever I hear two people singing, I listen to them sing, and then I listen to them sing again, and then I join in. And so it isn't like I'm nothing, but it's like, if I'm going to contribute meaningfully in a harmonious way to this song they're singing, I ought to pay attention first to what's going on. So it has a, and if I don't, and the song sounds bad, I can't blame them, right? I ought to look to myself. So there is a self-scrutiny component, but I don't see it as self-abnegation. I guess for me, self-assessment, because it can both lead to saying, yeah, I'm no good at this, but also to saying, it turns out I'm probably the best for the job here, right? That it's really just a realistic, evaluation of your abilities and skills and dispositions and contributions. And so it's not, it isn't sort of self-abasing or self-criticizing so much as self-assessing. So I see that as an important difference, at least for my context, and that also that it's just a non-theological framework. And I have nothing against, Christian humility or a theological framework for thinking about humility. I just think it doesn't translate neatly into sort of a democratic context, and trying to sort of distill God out to something thin enough that we can all agree on, I think isn't a particularly productive project. So I think it's just interesting to look for other sources for thinking about how we cultivate humility, even ones that are totally unfamiliar to most people. And actually that is part of the virtue of engaging with Confucian philosophy. Is very unfamiliar to most people. They don't bring any baggage about it, but it invites us to think about it in a very different way.
Well, I thank Nick and Karen for their questions. And Sarah, I just posed to you a question. Is fitting neatly a derivative of a hegemonic arrangement? Do things have to fit neatly, or can we allow for things to fit outside of the lines as we prescribe them? Nick, I certainly am coming from the school of thought that you offer. And Karen, I think that, as you know, much of the Christian tradition encompasses the Hebrew tradition. I do find the literal interpretation or the literal reading of Moses's words there to be a bit dramatic, but if we allow for flourish in the ways that we express ourselves, and I think they're still valuable. I don't think that humanity is nothing. God wouldn't have created humanity if we were nothing. But I think Moses is just trying to make a point there.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that Christianity and Judaism share, but also do in different ways, is to ground the practice of human humility in what sounds like a very radical or even heretical notion of divine humility. And you know, that's noted in Nick's question. And in fact, I mentioned about Hegel and the idea of reconciliation of science and morality. That's exactly what he appeals to, that Christian idea. But there's also, in addition to the Christian idea of kenosis, of divine self-emptying, there is the Jewish idea of divine self-limitation, by means of which alone creation and revelation can take place. Tzimtzum in Hebrew. One of my own current projects is comparing those two notions and looking at the conversation that's gone on between them, usually without being noted explicitly. I think we need, at least within the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's that notion of divine humility is extremely important, because going back to something that Reverend Little said, although we've talked within those traditions about individual humility, the institutions and authority figures of those faith traditions have not always been humble, and have often exercised a kind of arrogation that has created a great deal of harm. But if we can think about divine humility as a basis for a sort of institutional humility on the part of the tradition as well, then I think it's a really valuable thing.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think you raised the problem too of, you know, how compatible is humility with leadership, what we think of as leading a community or congregation or a political entity. And I think there'd be a lot more to discuss there. We're about out of time. Are there any sort of short concluding points that any of our panelists would like to make?
I just want to respond quickly to Reverend Little's question. That no, I don't think I mean, it is the hard sell of Confucianism in a democratic context, because democracy is all about conflict, and Confucianism does have a large impulse towards harmony. But Confucius also offers us ways of thinking about humility as the basis for proper resistance and proper insults to leaders who have failed, and proper rejection of the inherited norms, or kind of ways of interpreting and modifying them, but in ways that are not arrogant. So I do fundamentally, as a critical feminist theorist, want to leave open the possibility for rejecting hegemonic, subordinating systems, but doing it in ways that are not, burn it all down. Because as you pointed out, democratic love is about waking up tomorrow and going forward together, whether we like each other or not, because we love the world that we share.
Great, thank you.
Sounds a lot like Christianity.
That's a great place to end. I would just like to thank all of our panelists once more for being part of this terrific event, and thank the Agora Institute, and thank you all for coming.
Thanks so much, Dean and fellow panelists.
Yes, thank you. That was a wonderful discussion. I really appreciated being part of it.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Mm-hmm.